Okay, letting everyone in, and we can be off. Ready to go when you are, Maria.
Okay, am I pinned as a?
Yes.
Oh, I shouldn't be. I think it's better if I have, the similar position as everybody else. But hello, everybody. I'm really happy to welcome you today. I'm Maria. Many of you know me. I have recently become the president of the new exec, many of whom are here. You can recognize them. And this event today is rather a continuation from an initiative that we took with the previous executive committee under the presidency of Sarah Green, when we thought that some topics we can discuss with our members in a more democratic way and think of solutions together. And we did have a couple of webinars in the previous exec. One was on the transition to open access with our journal, and then there was the presentation also of our survey that Martin Fott published. And since especially the last exec, we have been trying to be more active and proactive on issues around lobbying, especially European institutions, and thinking of ways in which we engage with them, including on issues around, European national level and so forth, sponsoring institutions, including on levels around how funding is structured. And we have also had topics to discuss since the last two AGM meetings, which have to do with the ethics of research and also with structural issues like precarity. So today we are continuing this discussion, and we're thinking of this discussion in continuation with previous work that we've been doing, to discuss something that's been on our mind for a very long time, which is the European Union gives a lot of money. It is taxpayers' money, it's not the European Union's money, to us as researchers to present our research, to do research, to collect data. And there is an increasing push, as you would all know, about impact, about doing policy with our research, which is all great, except the problem is, when does the European Union actually listen to us when it comes to our research? And the problem is, as we would be discussing here, that it mostly doesn't. And we need to find ways to make it accountable to us as taxpayers, as researchers, and to the communities that we work with. So on that note, and also like what I think is another very pertinent topic for us is the question of what happens to scholars who are at risk and who are migrants themselves, who are suffering from displacement and from extreme political precarity, and when arriving to Europe and to more secure geographies, are also starting to suffer economic precarity because the European structures and stipends are short-term and they're not offering permanent escape and shelter. So on that note, I'd like to give the word to our exec member, Chowra Makaremi, who will be leading this discussion and who has been a voice that we have followed in it. and she would present the speakers and chair the discussion, and I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be taking part in my first EASA webinar. And I will just start by presenting our distinguished guest today. So we have with us Céline Cantat and Barak Kalir. Céline holds a PhD in social science from the University of East London. Her work focuses on migration, humanitarianism, solidarity mobilization, and she has done field research and actually very active observant participation, I would say, on pro-migrant movements in France, Italy, and the UK, but also along the Balkan route. Another interest of her is higher education and the politics of university access. She has been a postdoctoral researcher at the Central European University in Budapest and in the MAGIC ERC program, so the program on migration governance and asylum crisis at Sciences Po in Paris, where she is currently an academic advisor at the Paris School of International Affairs. And Barak is an associate professor in anthropology at the University of Amsterdam. He is the co-director of the Institute for Migration and Ethnic Studies and is currently involved in the H2020 project, Advancing Alternative Migration Governance. Barak recently rounded off an ERC-funded project entitled The Social Life of State Deportation Regimes. And among other publications, he recently co-edited a special issue of Social Anthropology called Researching Access: What do attempts at studying migration control tell us about the state? And of course, he is the co-author with Céline of a thought-provoking article published in Crisis magazine in May 2020, entitled Fund but Disregard: The EU's Relationship to Academic Research on Mobility, which raises crucial questions we would like to discuss further here in this seminar. So without further delay, I leave the floor to Barak and Céline. And my understanding is that Barak will first draw further on their argument developed in this article and also on the petition that was submitted to the Commission. And Céline will then put this debate in the wider context of research management and funding politics in the EU. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Chowra. Thank you, Maria and the executive for arranging this webinar. Let me maybe start by putting a bit the article that Céline and I wrote in the context of the letter that we also sent. Maybe many of you are also signatories to it. But for those who are not aware of the bigger context, so the immediate trigger that pushed us to write this letter to the EU president was the outbreak of COVID-19 last year, around February. As you mentioned, Chowra, I'm still working in a Horizon 2020 project that is called Advancing Alternative Migration Governance. So, and we are working with many universities in Europe and beyond, and we were all taken by the outbreak of COVID-19 and what does that mean for people that are, for border crossers that are stranded in makeshift camps and hotspots and detention centers. And we felt like we needed to do something beyond what each of us did maybe as a citizen. We thought we want to do something as academics. And then we were talking within the project, and I have to give actually most credit to our Greek colleagues. They were actually leading on it, especially my colleague, professor of anthropology in the Aegean University, Akis Papastariagis. And we thought, okay, we don't want to put another digital petition out there or just send an open letter or make this kind of a public statement. But we thought we want to actually do something like send a direct letter with being a bit audacious to the EU president. And we also actually directed it to 4 other commissioners that we thought are relevant for the issue. And what we put in the letter is public. I can also drop it in the chat for those who haven't had the chance to look at it. And we basically said, look, we have accumulated tons of knowledge from EU-funded projects that we were engaged in. And we want to put this knowledge at your disposal. I mean, this is yet again, another crisis, another emergency moment. And we have gathered so much information and knowledge on things like humanitarian borders and camps and hotspots and detention and deportation and solidarity movement and the interface with civil society and the role of subcontracting private companies. So why don't you take all this knowledge that we have and we're going to help you. So it was a very proactive kind of letter. And we're going to help you try to do the best in the kind of means and time that we have. And our idea was to send a soft call among our network so that we ask for signatories to this letter to be people that are actually working either as leading or researching within an EU-funded project. So we were thinking like whoever worked in FP7, what is nowadays Horizon 2020, or an ERC grant or a Marie Curie. So people that like our leverage, the leverage that we looked for was like, you invested money in us, we accumulated knowledge, expert knowledge, and now we want to put this knowledge back to you so that you can do the best policies in this kind of a, yet again, crisis moment. So although it was a soft call and we wanted to move on it very fast, within something like 2 days, we got 60 signatures. So we were very happy and we basically sent off the letter because time was also of the essence. After that, we also published the letter more publicly and within 2 weeks, something like that, we got another 300 scholars asking to join the letter as signatories. So we were overwhelmed not only by how many people wanted to join the letter, but also a lot of people voluntarily started to share with us the kind of stories of frustrations that they had, very similar to those that drove us to write the letter in the first place, like working on this kind of a very burning issues in the migration field and never being heard by or taken up by policymakers ever, not in their national context and not in the EU context. And then we got this call from Crisis Magazine. By the way, it's a fantastic magazine that is not supported by any commercial parties. It's run by, it's co-founded by Donia Aliniad, who contacted us and asked us if we want to write a piece more like reflecting on the experience of trying to push this kind of leverage on the EU, which then Céline and I did. And I think the piece is highlighting two important things. I will speak mostly only about one. I think maybe Céline will speak more about the other, or maybe we pick it up also in the discussion more. So the first one that I will not speak so much about is the need for accountability mechanism, a structural mechanism in how what is the uptake of EU-funded research. So if so much money goes into it, and just maybe to give an idea, between 2014 and 2020, 3 billion euro went into funding research on the topic of asylum, migration, and integration in the European Union. 3 billion euro. I mean, we can all imagine what else can have been done with that money, but fine, it was put into doing research. So we were like thinking, okay, with all that kind of money that is poured into doing research, what is actually being done with it? And to our frustration, we I think all realized that very little is being done for it. And again, we can all talk maybe later and discuss why that is the case. I just want to give like one example from a field that is very close to my research. So if we think about how detention is being put into a policy in the EU, then the standard period for detaining illegalized migrants for the sake of deportation now in the EU was put at 18 months. And that was done by the recast of the return directive a couple of years back. And at that point, it pushed 21 member states to actually put higher the period of detention, mandatory detention for deporting illegalized migrants, because they had it lower than 18 months. And in my research, we asked a lot of practitioners in the field, what is the reasonable, I mean, people that are running detention centers or deportation units in different EU member states. And we asked them, like, what is the reasonable time that you need to detain someone for deportation? And the answer is systematically, almost in every EU member state that we did research in, was in between 2 to 3 months. So, and you have to think that, like, some of the countries that deport most illegalized migrants in Europe, like France and Spain, for many years, the maximum length of detention of illegalized migrants was 45 days or 60 days. So from that kind of a length, the European Union decided to put it at 18 months. And also now with the Migration and Asylum Pact, the minimum standard was actually put up to 3 months in the first time you detain an illegalized migrants. Totally contrary to any evidence that we ever gathered empirically by doing research that is funded by the EU. So this kind of disparity or this kind of gap between what we find as researchers and what the EU then translate into policies, I think this is one very worrying thing that merit a lot of discussion, thinking why is that the case and can we do something about it to sort of force structurally the EU to be accountable to at least respond to what we find when we do research with EU money. And the second point that I think came out very strongly from our reflection in the piece, and I want to talk a little bit more about that, is basically the question of, like, why do we still produce so much knowledge on oppressive mobility regimes with money from the EU? Of course, it relates to the first one. I mean, we are very frustrated about what actually happens with this research. So we really have to ask ourselves, why are we still doing it? And here I think there are 3 main reasons that we can think, like, that's why we're doing it. And I will just run by the 3. I will refute the first 2 and make the point about the third one. So I think the first point would be that we do it for scholarly purposes. So basically to push academic debates, to fashion new understanding, to come up with new concepts, to educate our students about what's happening, and this kind of more like internally scholarly academic purposes. But then to just refute it, I think that for this purpose, we definitely don't need millions of euros to do this kind of huge project in order to get to this kind of scholarly debate. And in addition, I also personally think that, like, the urgency of the subject matter, the fact that what we are actually researching is the horrible, inhumane condition in which so many thousands of people are amongst us are living. I think that this kind of a scholastic purpose cannot be, like, the main thing why we say that we need so many millions of euros to do research on this topic. So that would be for me like a no-go. The second one is that we hope to have social impact. We are also, of course, anyone who ever wrote a grant in the last years knows that this is like an essential thing. You have to show what kind of a social impact your project will have, and then you have to dance a lot around it to eventually show that supposedly you had social impact. Whereas in practice, we all know that our social impact is very minimal. And there again, just to refute that as the main reason why we go for this huge grant, I don't think here again we need millions of euros in order to have what we called in the social sciences, at least, a social impact, which basically boils down to informing public opinion, to writing op-eds, or I don't know, appearing on TV every now and then. I don't think we need so many millions for that. And I think at the same time, there are like public intellectuals that are doing a much better job than us on that, right? Many of them, by the way, are ex-academics that are working now in journalism or in ass-kicking NGOs and social movements and migrant platforms. And I think they are doing it very well. And to be very honest, I think much better than most of us academics. So that would, again, not be for me a reason why we're still producing so much knowledge for the with EU money. So then I want to get to the third point, that that is basically that we're doing it for our own career. And now I'm speaking from my very personal experience. I think that having a very big grant, so I had an ERC grant, is definitely something that secures your tenure position. It secures actually a promotion in the hierarchy in academia, which is very much, these things are very much nowadays, as we all know, dependent on bringing big money, on bringing the grants in. So we are actually all playing in this kind of a show me the money academic sector, right? And I think this is a very big incentive of why a lot of us are actually doing this kind of research or going for these big grants. We also all know that if you win one of these big grants, that you get more time to publish, to advance your career in that respect. You have to teach less. You are invited to more conferences, or you can put conferences yourself if you like to, because you have all this money. So it actually also enhances this dynamic of the winner takes it all, which I think is a very neoliberal dynamic. There is also a pet dependency there. If you got one big grant, the chances that you will get another big grant is actually higher. So the competition with all your colleagues is also not on a fair playing level field. So it just sort of reproduced this idea that this very competitive neoliberal academic field. And this is basically my conclusion, or what I want to leave my very short talk with. That's coming out of my ERC grant, my biggest feeling is that I was taking part in very actively in contributing to the social reproduction of a very sick academic field. And just to also put some points here, that it's not just a feeling. I mean, something in the range of 20 to 40% of every big grant money goes by now to overheads of university bureaucracy, right? And if I'm very honest with myself, I don't think my research at the end of the day had such a big social impact that I can say that it merits so much of the EU budget. And yeah, so and another just reflection on my side on that kind of a big project. I also don't think that anthropology actually stands to benefit so much from running these kind of huge projects. I have a feeling that most of the research that I did before, like a very small scale research that concerned mostly myself and having a budget, it mostly meant that I can buy a flight ticket somewhere or go there by train, was more than enough for me to do that kind of knowledge production that I was after. And this kind of playing with the big grants is also just like us showing that we can do the same. Something that, again, I think is at the end of the day quite unsatisfying and even self-defeating. So with this a bit more pessimistic note, I think I will conclude my contribution and pass it on to Céline.
Thanks, Barak, and thanks so much, Chowra and Maria and the Executive Committee of the EASA for the kind invitation. As Chowra said, in the next 15 minutes, I will just try to connect our reflections that Barak just presented on the politics of EU research funding to some broader issues, perhaps some of the issues of interest to the EASA, their implication for academic labor, for academic freedom, which Barak also touched upon. And maybe it's interesting that in a way I have a very different positions to Barak's, because I'm not a tenured anthropologist. I'm not even a researcher anymore. I'm still in higher education, but in an altogether different kind of position. So some of the implications, I think, of the mechanism of EU funding are a little bit different for people who are still in the earlier stages of academic careers. But anyway, those are just a set of ideas I wanted to share, which perhaps can provide avenues for collective reflections. And one thing I wanted to do is just to go back over the trajectory of my own encounters with the European Commission in relation to migration research, because probably as many others, I first encountered the European Commission as an object or a subject of study and not primarily as a funding body. So during my PhD research, I was looking at how migration solidarity groups we're reorganizing across borders against or in the context of the Europeanization of border and migration policies. So sort of social movement dynamics and evolving practices as the legal frameworks governing migration and migrants in the EU are evolving. And obviously the European Commission then was a key actor because of its role in actualizing an exclusionary reading of a European identity, mobilizing migrants as figures of otherness, and also as one of the targets against which my participants were organizing. So I think the reflections that I developed in my doctoral research about, what kind of desirable political identities and subjectivities and forms of actions were active in the field of migration also helped me to think through the politics of EU research funding in relation to migration. So which research becomes valued and listened to, which becomes neglected, disciplines, or perhaps even criminalized. And so, I think thinking about the politics of EU research funding is also about reflecting on who gets funding for what project in affiliation with which institution, under which conditions this research is carried out, and of course, what happens to the knowledge produced with this money. And that's the sort of second capacity in which I encountered the European Commission, because I obtained a Marie Curie research fellowship after finishing my PhD. Indeed, as many of my peers, obtaining my PhD meant entering the competitive race for postdocs and short-term academic contracts that supposedly allow us to survive academically and materially until we get the permanent position, and this sort of stability materializes. And as I said, in my case, actually it didn't materialize, and I moved on to doing other things. And I got that grant, as we explained in the piece with Barak, to continue research into migration solidarity practices, along what had emerged as a key focus of both academic research and European policymaking at the time, in a context of crisis, namely along the so-called Balkan route. So, I found myself in that position, which I think many of us have experienced, where the European Commission funded me to, criticize the practices and policies that it was developing, which, arguably is an ambivalent position, which we need to negotiate, but I'm not at all overstating the uniqueness of this contradiction, because Barak, you were also looking at deportation policy, and you were funded by the EC to essentially criticize the sort of political approach it put towards those migrants. But what was interesting for me in that process was that the sort of many steps I went through get funding, because the first time I was rejected, which is, again, I think a very common experience. And therefore, I was encouraged to attend a number of workshops on, how to apply for EU funding, how to perform, research professional identities in relation to the kind of desirable type of postdoc opportunities, funding opportunities that exist. I reworked my proposal to give a more project form to my research idea, to turn it into something that's more sellable, that's more recognizable to the sort of EU framing of what good research is. And as Barak said, and we try to discuss in our piece, this crucially includes featuring a range of policy-related impacts and deliverables. So of course, I played that game, and I included all those policy impact type of deliverables, which, at the time of writing, I already knew were absolutely meaningless and would never be taken up. And I think the fact that the content or the topic of the research was to a large extent secondary, or at least not more fundamental than the design of the research and the format of the research, was always very clear to me, and probably to many of us as we write this proposal. And in fact, at least as a Marie Curie fellow, you are not even required to submit any of your academic outputs throughout your 2 or 3 years of funding. So it was only at the very end that we had to produce this kind of massive report, which took us, weeks, and which we never received any comment or feedback about. And I know other types of scientific projects have more scientific academic committees, but actually for Marie Curie, there is no monitoring or feedback mechanism regarding what you produce in terms of content. And the final deliverable of this project, which had been centralized as a key feature to secure funding in my proposal, was a policy brief on how to include some of the insight from solidarity practices I'd been analyzing and observing into migration policies. And that's really the point where the sort of absurdity and the violence of the situation became unbearable, since by the time I finalized my project, all the solidarity sites which I had studied between 2017 and 19 had essentially been decimated, and many, if not all of them, directly or indirectly through European funding or through the actions and decisions of politicians that sat in the European Commission. So at the time, I didn't want and I refused to write this policy brief, and instead wrote a brief paper which was called something like "Why Are Policy Briefs Meaningless?" And then I imagine no one ever read it, and in any case, no one ever asked for, the promised policy briefs. And then when I finished my Marie Curie, I was invited to be an evaluator for H2020 and Marie Curie project proposals. And so I sort of moved to the other side of or to another position within the funding site. And it was also very interesting and intriguing to see how funding allocation happens from inside or from that perspective. I believe there's a bit of a field of struggle there, which brings together academics and scholars acting as evaluators, partly as I did, in the hope that you could channel some of this money towards a worthy project or researchers that might need it, but who still have to operate under a set of bureaucratic rules and a sort of supervisory structures under which academic knowledge production and academic critique do become marginal matters. Like, we are looking for how proposal ticks certain boxes, and not necessarily for a critical evaluation of the content. And in fact, we receive a set of guidelines, and the European Commission Research Directorate defines good research in those guidelines as research that improves Europe's competitiveness, boosts its growth, creates jobs, and tackles current and future societal challenges. So in that sense, we see that this question that Barak, you also raised of the public and social role of research is already resolved in a very specific way. And the fundamental question of what form of political and economic community we operate in or we want to operate towards is sort of already posited as some kind of unquestionable framework. And the sort of discussion happens after this has been established. So we just sort of remain involved in discussion on how to adjust a set of procedures to, assess research in the most governable way, transparent way, to make research funding allocation a sort of fair process. But the sort of biggest question of the relation of research to politics and to society is never raised and never asked. And I mean, of course, there are margins of negotiations when you are within that process, but I think key issues are just removed from any kind of public or political debates. And of course, as Barak also said, the reproduction of this system is related to broader shifts in conditions of academic labor, the withdrawal of public funds, the increasing reliance on private or European money, which, as Maria reminded us of, is public money. But nonetheless, the fact that we are in more and more precarious position when it comes to finding stable, publicly funded position at the national level. And every year the number of proposals received under each of these funding streams in the EC, the number goes up. And this is always seen as a sign of the efficiency and the success of the European vision for research. I think it's often something the European Commission boasts about. So I remember last year it was like, oh, we've broken the record like 3 years in a row for the number of Marie Curie proposals we've received. Of course, we also know that this is because there are very little other options for essentially junior scholars to secure any form of income. But I think the relation between EU funding and academic labor condition has actually different aspects. It's, as you said, Barak, actively reproducing the neoliberal academia. And I experienced this also as an evaluator. I remember, for instance, making that comment on H2020 proposals that I was evaluating, that it obviously, it was obvious that it was a project that was set up in a way that would lead to extremely exploitative conditions for postdocs, because there was insane number, of deliverables to submit, very little human resources. And actually the point was outly rejected by the European Commission person that was coordinating the evaluation. And I was told that we're assessing a proposal against a set list of criteria, which don't include work conditions, and this is basically irrelevant, and that's not part of the way that the European Commission evaluates research proposals. And of course, even a step further, when EU funding becomes a crucial source of income for us, and I see what you said, Barak, about the source of prestige, but for some of us, it's also a source of sort of basic material reproduction. We become increasingly dependent on our ability to sort of fulfill and perform this vision of research and research career and evolution that's promoted by the EU. And therefore, on our ability to present ourselves as fundable, and therefore our ability to show that we can produce policy impact along those already determined lines. And in the field of migration, that really raises very important question about how do we speak to those policymakers in a way that could be accounted as, amounting to policy impact. And I think Chowra will comment further on this in a minute, but this means reproducing very specific representations and ideas and languages to speak about migrants and migration. Because the only way to indeed be heard by people who are sitting as policymakers in the Commission is to reproduce or reiterate those very exclusionary, violent, sometimes murderous tropes. So we have to annex our way to speak about the social world, to analyze the social world, to conduct research basically to pre-existing politics, which are often not necessarily the one we want to reproduce. And I think it's very perverse the way in which the onus then falls on researchers, to develop more skills and show more persistence and attend more training workshop and present better facts in better ways with more images and colors and graphs, because this is the sort of benchmark against which the quality of their research is going to be assessed. And they are sort of stuck in a catch-22 position where the inability to change policy making is seen as a reflection on the bad quality of their research, as if policy making happened outside of any politics or outside of any ideological framework. And again, I think many of us working on migration would remember the numerous conferences that we had to attend between especially the post so-called migration crisis period, where academics were invited to meet policymakers. And in particular, I remember seeing some of my colleagues questioning the language of policymakers around, the production of illegality and how we speak about people produced as illegalized, as you were saying, Barak. And us as scholars literally being told that no dialogue is possible as long as we refuse to speak the rational language of the Commission that reflects an existing factual reality. There are legal people, there are illegal people. If we can't even agree on this, there's no point in even continuing the dialogue. So, I mean, it has this very disciplinary effect. And perhaps that's the last point I wanted to go to. Like, this is also, of course, an issue of academic freedom at that point, about how we are allowed or authorized or valued in the way that we speak about things and the sort of research we put forward. And this is something we tried to explore with in a recent piece with our friend and colleague Pinar Donmez, who is here today, I think. And we're drawing on the work of several colleagues, including Maria's, about thinking about how the reproduction of neoliberal academia and academic precarity is also essentially a discussion about what would constitute appropriate material conditions for meaningful knowledge to be produced and valued. So trying to move beyond, very abstracted liberal understanding of academic freedom and come back to the material means by which we can be in position to produce socially meaningful knowledge today. And I think it's just interesting that in this short piece, which came out in Radical Philosophy with Pinar, we explain how we were actually suspended by our then university, the Central European University, in 2018, after a law had been adopted in Hungary that threatened to levy a tax on organizations that promoted, and I quote, positive visions of migration. And at the time, both our positions were short-term contracts funded by European money. Pinar was working as on an Erasmus Plus project on access to higher education for displaced students, and I was conducting migration solidarity research. So our research was essentially criminalized. Our institution performed the criminalization. And at the time, CEU had emerged, in the global discourse around the higher education as this last bastion of academic freedom in the liberal East. And the suspension of a few, temporary staff did not weaken at all the liberal aura of the university, and it did not at all alter its self-representation as, the best university in the region, as testified by its ability to attract EU funding precisely, So while it became a source of liberal prestige for the institution, this European funding did not even protect us against the criminalization of our most basic activities, like doing research and teaching. So this is not necessarily a more positive conclusion than yours, Barak, but I think it just points to the fact that it's very urgent that we have this political and critical conversation about the politics of European research funding, not just because it reproduces neoliberal academia or commodified higher education, but because it also does very little, if not sometimes participate in reproducing authoritarian politics. And I think this leads the way to Chowra's points. So I'll leave you the floor, and thanks again.
Thank you very much, Céline, and thank you, Barak, for these elements that set the discussion. So maybe I will just, as we prepare this webinar, I discuss about an element that maybe has a part to play in the general picture. So I will both bring in this element, but also maybe react a little bit. I mean, open up the discussion before giving the floor to the participants, to the other participants. So there are two things I would have liked to wanting to add and the reaction. When you're talking, Céline, about this technocracy of research management and funding, and what is the conception of research and research impact within this universe, I thought it was important to just remind a discussion that I had, an interview I had with a jurist, Elspeth Giles, who has been counseling, actually advising the EU Parliament, but also the EU Commission on migration laws for more than 20 years. So she has a critical approach that she develops with Didier Bigot in many publications around specifically the Schengen visas in the early years 2000. But as she was reflecting back on her experience, she was highlighting how the Commission is, so the DG Home and the European Commission, the decision makers within the European Commission that are working on migration are not neutral, objective bureaucrats, and then you would have to learn to speak their language, and so you could push forward your ideas. But if you go back to the history of how DG Home was solidified, crystallized after the Amsterdam Treaty in '99, and how which gives to the EU some prerogatives on asylum and migration control, then what happens in reaction is that the most conservative and anti-migrant, basic anti-migrant views moved from the interior ministries to the member state interior ministry onto the Commission. So there has been a political move, and we're not facing a neutral, objective, rational, legal, Bavarian bureaucracy that we have to learn to stick to, but we really have to also be conscious, and also research can help dig out that process of who are we facing, what is the politics and what is the ideology. Like she was So this jurist, legal scholar, was using very radical wording of the DG Home. The Commission has been colonized by anti-immigrant view, and this is what explains the gap between knowledge production or basic, not even knowledge production, but basic assessment of reality and figures that are produced by EU bodies themselves, such as Eurostat. So we are not even going into critical research, but there is a gap with those data that report on migration and the decisions that are made. So one thing was that, so how do we take that into account? And the other thing was maybe to start the discussion, my reaction to Barak's provocative point on the function of research funding in the power knowledge relation. And just I had the impression that here, so basically the money is there, the research, as Céline explained, research goes through project funding, and this is a trend that we cannot reverse in the present situation. So we are not able to convince our member states, the state of the universities we are in, we're not able to convince them to go back and fund, universities and research centers, etc. Everything goes into those ERC programs and etc. So this is the case. So if we don't do critical research with that, then other kinds of research will be done with that. And I'm talking from the point of view of someone who has done her PhD and postdoc on critical migration, critical border studies, and who deserted that field. Like I stopped doing research on that and I'm not going back because I thought that we have enough research. We have enough knowledge now, we have to disseminate it and to make impact. But still, I got an ERC program to work on Iran because I had the impression that getting the EU money was a way for me in the knowledge power relationship, was a way for me to change power relations within the field of Iranian studies. So and I'm afraid that if we desert, that the funding and these programs, what will become of the power relations, the intellectual, academic power relations, different trends, schools of thought, methodologies, etc., within the academic fields we're in. And also the argument that Barak, you're making about the social impact. So maybe public intellectuals are doing better the job of academics, but they're not doing it well enough because, as Céline was reminding, every European society is on the verge of fascism and or already permeated by fascism. So they're not doing it enough. And the fact that we are all failing, public intellectuals and academics, as also sometimes public intellectuals, we are failing now, is not an argument. I mean, it's not the same kind of argument for me. This failure argument is not the same kind of argument than the other argument. So there is a failure we have to acknowledge, and I don't see any other response to that than fail again, fail better, because it's not as if we had many choices. It's not as if there were many. So the rudderhead is what it is, and our societies are what they are. So how do we rethink the relationship between academic knowledge production and social and political participation? This is not. I don't think this is a subject we can escape. And so my question was about. And also, just to finish that, the other actors that are that participate in creating this social impact and that are not successing either, they face the same problem than the academics. Because I'm thinking about, for instance, the NGO I did my research with within a migrant detention facility in France, the ANAFE, and they got funding from the EU. Not to of course to help resist against police control in the waiting zone, but because they were creating jobs for young Europeans, because they were giving legal training to their volunteers, and they were creating these jobs. So this problem, functioning that you're pointing out of career, of funding, of the relationship is something that other fields that are engaged in social resistance, political resistance are facing as well. So this was my kind of reaction, and maybe we can open up the discussion because we have a generous 35 more minutes, so maybe we can take more reactions and questions before giving you back the floor, if it's okay with you.
So thanks for this, and just maybe, it would be nice if people write in the chat if they have questions, just so that they can come up and be elevated to speakers. That's why we did it. We made the whole webinar on Zoom so that people can switch their cameras themselves and come to the quote unquote podium. So I'd be really happy if more people get involved, but I can also, kind of come back to some of the points while we're waiting for others to maybe join in. And so I think the point that Chowra just made about, deserting the field, and that, so I think in EASA at present, where our debate with also lobby group stands, is that we are increasingly trying to think of how to turn the clock back, how to return some of the funding to universities. Of course, there is a bigger problem there. So universities, we're much beyond the time when universities are these pristine public institutions that are just, deprived from funding from national governments. As Barak mentioned, we are dealing with big redistribution of public funds into private hands. So a lot of the funding is public. We are made to compete for it in a rat race. When the universities get funding, they put 40% into overheads. And a lot of these overheads are not money that comes back to departments that have won the funding, or schools that have won, or let alone being redistributed, say, to disciplines that are not competitive in these bigger grants, like classics and music maybe. But instead they become part of a bigger pot of gold that is then given into public-private partnerships. And then we have dorms, and then we have new campuses that are built, and then we have more surveillance mechanisms and data collection that is happening through all sorts of new partnership with devices, with big tech companies and so forth. So where we're at is that we have to renegotiate the whole question of what is done with this funding. So from the individual point of view, perhaps the question is, do you engage at all? Do you have the choice to not engage? As Céline said, it is a rat race. You are in a position to secure, especially as an early career academic, funding as an only way into a kind of very insecure job market. But on the other, there is the bigger debate, what do universities do with this money that we win? And would we be able, if we bring it back to universities, to make them more accountable about how, first, the money is spent, and secondly, to make funders and to make universities as funders more accountable to what they do with our findings? How do we turn the conversation the other way around, and we ask, why aren't they accountable to us? They have appointed us. We're the specialists, we're the experts, even if we don't like that word. We do have this vibe around, even in very participatory research, some knowledge that's produced that is valuable. Why can't we hold the European Union accountable to actually get involved in implementing this knowledge? So now we're kind of in a conversation, I think, where we have to think of what are the mechanisms to actually pose this as a more pertinent question back to these institutions, both internally in universities and to funding bodies. So that would be how I personally, and hopefully, EASA as an organization engages in this field. So how do we make ourselves heard? Because we have to be heard, and because we have to renegotiate the way funding structures function, because they are not functioning for the public. Yeah. Chris, do you want to please stand up and ask your question also publicly so that we can continue the discussion more live?
Hello, hi there. I don't know if there's a good microphone on this computer, whether you can hear me, or it's a new machine. Hey, thanks for the intervention, Céline and Barak. I thought it's really interesting. I just wanted to intervene in this conversation about why we, I mean, firstly, I don't think we should be surprised that the EU doesn't have any built-in mechanism for trying to pick up on and receive and act upon our kind of knowledge. I mean, I think they probably view themselves as brokers, intermediaries between, you know, the nation state, national governments and funding bodies. I don't think they probably don't even have the capacity to, you know, to take serious, to listen and read to all our kind of outputs and then to act on them. It'd be good to, as you're saying now, to actually suggest that maybe this should be something that they should include in their budgetary spending plan, some sort of, you know, to complete the feedback loop. But my own thought is that maybe the trick is more to, you know, to use EU funding to subvert the kind of, you know, the bureaucratic narrow agenda, or if it, you know, if immigration policy has been colonized by very conservative people from the Netherlands or where else, you know, try to, you know, I suppose once we've taken the money from the EU as a postdoc or as a principal investigator, I don't think you're beholden to the EU to come up with policy, you know, recommendations or knowledge that they require, you know, in the sense that our universities still protect us with this sort of idea, at least in theory, that, you know, in academic freedom means that we should be able to interpret our data and come up with different ways of doing that. We don't have to speak back their language. And finally, you know, the EU is not a unified actor in any sense. And even within the Commission, you know, you'll find different officials who have different positions. And probably the best way to get the European Commission to act is to make alliances with the European Parliament, because MEPs are much more receptive to public opinion. They are always looking for, you know, ways of influencing the Commission. And I think maybe a good strategy would be to team up with concerned MEPs and try to, you know, write our critical reports and our op-eds in alignment with them, because I think many of them probably would agree with, you know, with the kind of knowledge that you're producing.
Can I say something, Maria or Chowra? Sorry.
Yes,
thanks.
I mean,
Yeah, no, I mean, I think thanks, Chris and Maria, and to pick up on that last point, I know that both Barak and I have already discussed, you know, like, how do you subvert the use of this fund? I think both of us have done it in a range of ways, through how we distribute this money once we get it, how we channel it to different actors, groups, activist groups, etc. I know that in my topic on solidarity practices, that's obviously something that comes up, because my you know, key interlocutors are people who are involved in subversive political practices in that field. And of course, I work with them and support them in as much as I can. But I think that doesn't, you know, sort of resolve the broader question of, first, sort of commodification of our knowledge on the broader scale, the issue of the fragmentation of our rights and precarization of our contracts, as presumably mostly as early career academics, but I think also further down the line. And then, you know, there's the all other issues that you've brought up of how do we influence in general as academics or as other actors migration policy at the European level, which, you know, that issue of do we side with MEPs, do we try to push against the increasingly conservative commissions? That's of course a very important debate. But I think even in that equation, and I have done reports for various left groups at the European Parliament, their margin of maneuver in shaping European migration policy is super limited as well. But not to say that it's not something we should not be doing more massively, but I think all those strategies are interesting, but they also have their limits, and they're all connected, but there are different issues as well, you know, like shaping migration policy and shaping higher education policies. There are two debates that we should have sort of jointly, but also think about a little bit separately. And I think the EASA has done a great job in terms of bringing the issue of academic precarity on the agenda. And I know, Maria, perhaps you can tell us more about this, that you were pushing for instance, the inclusion of certain regulation regarding postdocs and, you know, minimum sort of provisions for labor rights of like people who can be in extremely structurally subaltern relationships. Because for instance, if you enter an ERC project or as a postdoc or as a PhD candidate, you really structurally at the mercy of your principal investigator. So if you're lucky and you have like someone who's both aware and committed to not reproduce insane academic hierarchies and terrible working conditions, that's great. But you know, that's very much an arbitrary situation of which kind of PI you get to. So I think that's also this issue of the super individualization of research that animates EU research funding. And it links in with what you were saying, Barak, about, you know, the EU imagination of an academic career. You start with a Marie Curie, and then maybe you like coordinate a work package in an H2020, and then you're a PI for H2020, and then you get your ERC. And the more you go along this path, the more sort of competitive you become, and you keep reproducing that particular idea of what's the new sort of not really attached to any nation state academic system, because you have mobility requirements at different stages. So you're moving around, you're very much like uprooted. And that's also a very specific image of the role of academics and their relation to an imagined European space, which we know not to exist, but you're supposed to circulate freely, floating across, you know, that political sphere that is European in essence and super liberal, etc. So I think those are also things we might want to think about. Perhaps it goes with what you were saying, Maria, about how to reroute certain things.
Yeah, and again, I'd really like more people to join the conversation. And I think like the fact that we invited two people who had a Marie Curie or ERC doesn't mean that those who haven't had them can't, you know, share their experience, including of national level funding, because that's another kind of worms. So we're now targeting EU funding also because we, as a European association, can probably be more active on a general level that can have repercussion, you know, nationally. But national funding agencies are not less problematic or less colonizing. I think colonizing is a good word to use here. Also, you know, referring to what Chowra said, but in terms of, you know, we're working in a field where on the so there's so many levels at which like coloniality of power works, you know. So you're starting with the level of your research participants, you know, who are extracted from their data with a kind of promise that maybe you would be helping them, maybe somehow, someday. That then, you know, moves on to your local interlocutors, who can be sometimes scholars, research assistants, and so forth on the ground, who are usually, and that's another question, you know, how are they paid, how much, you know, the redistribution happens on that level, and how equal it is, because many of them might be paid but might not get authorship or, you know, right to speak. And then, you know, we kind of work up to the level of the food chain, where a lot of scholarship nowadays is not scholarship really, it's management. Because, you know, you show that you're able to manage big grants. You know, so by the time that you kind of have gone up that ladder, and I don't want to point to Chowra and Barak here, you know, that's not the point, but, you know, by the time that you've kind of come up the ladder of all these funding streams and, you know, managing packages and so forth, a lot of times you don't have time to do research. You can't take a train. You have to send a postdoc to take the train, and in the meantime, you have to file in a report. So more and more, we're not even engaging directly in this food chain with our interlocutors, research participants, but we are managing, you know, levels of funding and levels of labor that we can't even influence. You know, we can't. There's not even a structure that allows you, if you hire a postdoc within a ERC, to allow them to be in a career ladder that gets them into a permanent position, let alone anything else. So there's something very violent in that chain, and it's true, by the time that you've kind of reached the level that, you know, you're given all the security, you've actually had to pass through a lot of corpses on the way, so to speak. So this is something that, yeah, I think Barak wants to speak to.
Yeah, I want to jump in. Thanks, Maria, for taking the discussion to where you did. And but I want to go back to the comment by Chris, and I want to actually insist that, yeah, we should be surprised, because if we're not surprised, it's actually that we're not doing justice to how the game is being played. Because, and I can speak from my experience, when I finished my ERC, I had to write like a huge I had to write like a huge content report with recommendations, policy recommendations, but it also had to be a huge financial report of my entire project for 5 years, and I don't know how much money that went into it. Now, my content report, that was something like 40 pages, was never, I think, read by anyone. I never ever got any comments for it. Whereas my financial report went back and forth from the European Commission for 6 months. It was eventually also audited externally by PricewaterhouseCoopers, which gods know how much money was going into that. And I mean, why should I not be surprised? You know, I think if we are allowing ourselves to just take it all for as if it's self-evident, and of course this is what it is, I mean, we're not doing justice to how the game is played. I think this kind of not accepting it and thinking, well, why are there mechanisms for financial audit, but there are no mechanism for accountability to policymaking on the content of what we have found, whereas the EC is constantly claiming that it's doing evidence-based policy. So something is really rotten, and I think we should, I mean, the only hope we have is that if we keep being surprised about it, not just taking it, you know, with a pinch of salt and saying, well, this is how it is, you know?
Can I come back on that? I definitely wasn't advocating that we take it as it is and treat it as a fait accompli. No, I'm saying we shouldn't be surprised, because, yeah, we know the nature of the game, but I'm completely with you. I mean, I'm disgusted at the way that, and I think Maria uses the word colonization absolutely spot on. You know, what we've seen is that the latest phase in, if you like, academic capitalism has resulted in the total colonization of research funding by a set of external consultants and advisors, you know, generally KPMG, PwC, Ernst & Young, Deloitte, and a handful of others, McKinsey and so on. And the commission, you know, has either been captured by them or is part of this logic. But yeah, call them out. I'm completely with you on this. I think if we have the courage to do that, and this is where we need our professional societies to come in, rather than junior academics who have just sort of one step away from a PhD, who are gonna feel vulnerable. I mean, it's quite brave to bite the hand that feeds you, but this kind of corruption of a kind of an institution and a funding mechanism really does need to be highlighted and foregrounded, and we can do whatever we can to expose it, because it really needs to change. And I agree. I mean, I've never been privileged or burdened by an ERC grant, but from what I can see, they are potentially incredibly corrupting and very, very damaging to all sorts of people. certainly, you know, the junior researchers on them, and sometimes even for the principal investigator.
Yeah, can I jump in? So yeah, thanks, Chris. So I think we're definitely on the same place. I think the word corruption is very due here in this discussion, in how money is actually funneled through this, like Maria was saying, through these big grants actually to sponsor or finance this kind of huge neoliberalized mechanism that the university has turned out to be. But I also want to go back to something that Chowra, you said about, well, do we have another option? Is it only fail again, fail better? And I want to suggest that we might do. I mean, I don't know where it will take us, but I mean, I'm thinking a bit more like becoming abolitionist about these big grants. I never applied, by the way, for another big grant after my experience. I thought, okay, also given the kind of account that I have of it, I don't want to participate in it anymore. I really feel almost ashamed that I've taken part in it in the first place. So I think, yeah, we can also become a bit more radical. I'm not sure where it takes us, because like you say, if we don't pick up this money from the floor, someone else will, and maybe that someone will actually reproduce that system even more. And is that something good? I don't know, but I think this is where our thinking has to go to. And also with respect to like take the money and run with it and do subversive thing. I know for sure that Céline has done it, and many other colleagues that I know have done it. I've done it myself to an extent that, because this is recorded, I cannot share with you what I've done. But I cannot also tell you that it's so satisfying, you know, because I also realized that at the end of the game, I got so much money. Some of it I managed to subvert, but it's really the very small, tiny part of it that was up for that. And I cannot pat myself on the shoulder and say, look what you've done great. You took the money and you made it work in different ways. So I'm getting much more into the abolitionist idea about this game. And I'm worried about it, as all of you probably. Like, I don't know where it takes us. If some of us that are more engaged actually and concerned will do that, but I think that I also don't see I'm also not satisfied by fail better, fail again, fail better.
Chandana, you wanted, you had a question, the floor is yours. And
yeah,
then
sure.
Prem Kumar. Okay.
Okay, so I was just going to say that, you know, it's not just an issue that it's not used. It's also that in its disregard, it's being used in a particular way. So it actually performs the function of showing the EU to be self-critical, ready to re-examine policies. And, you know, it's actually, they have it in their back pocket. There's something they can pull out by saying, look, we funded all this research and it was really critical of our policies. And, you know, in a way, it's a way of muting that opposition. So it actually is being used. You know, it's not being not used. But nonetheless, you know, the point that you were making, Chowra, about, you know, how can it be an option to just walk away from it? And Barak is making a very persuasive case, because as I was writing this, he was speaking about his abolitionist sort of stance towards it. It's a strong case, but you know there'll be people. We know that within anthropology, there is a very neoliberal stream coming through, and that there will be people who will actually, you know, take this money and do something really terrible with it. So just that question to throw into the mix.
There was another question or comment.
Yeah, I think that might have been me. Thank you. Thank you to the speakers. It was, and the organization, the organizers. It's really nice to hear this. I think it's a super important set of questions to discuss. I want to say something which is maybe a little obvious, and I know that that the speakers are well aware of this, and this is a more general point. I think it's important to sometimes to provincialize or move away from the focus on EU funding I'm not saying this is what is happening here, but I've seen elsewhere where there's a tendency to focus on the EU as a mechanism that reproduces inequality in higher education. Yes, it does that, but it didn't invent inequality in higher education. And it doesn't mean that we remove and I totally agree with Maria about moving funding away, public funding away from the Commission and its democrats or universities. It doesn't mean that we are going to have an equal or fair or even interesting disbursement of funding. And I also don't think it is neoliberal either. It is neoliberal, but neoliberalism reproduces a sense of inequality that has existed already in universities and has had its entrenchment in the way universities function, certainly in the Western world. It's partly to do with prestige and partly to do in the way in which certain forms of prestige is tied to certain forms of material reward against the control of the work of others, the reducing of junior professors and adjuncts to very, very poor material positions. So my point is that it's important to try to move away to acknowledge the EU's role in all of this, but to also understand that the EU, I don't believe, invented the structure of inequality, but furthered it, certainly, and the structure of inequality remains deeply embedded into how we produce knowledge in universities today. The university where I'm from, Central Europe University, when they were in Hungary, they've moved from Hungary now, been kicked out of Hungary now. The salaries that people got there were literally 8 to 10 times higher than people in other Hungarian universities. The differences between a professor's salary and an assistant professor salary, or a postdoc salary, or a staff member salary is huge. And certainly neoliberalism has a part to play in this, but a certain idea of knowledge and knowledge production, the prestige attached to it, enables academics in certain positions to gain control of funds, collective social funds for the university. And these funds become privatized into salaries. It is partly neoliberalism, but I don't believe it is entirely neoliberalism. And I think this process has been going on for a while, and I think is reproduced by the European Commission and by neoliberalism, but it is not, they are not the end all and be all of this process.
Thank you very much, and maybe if there is I can use a bit of time also to I would like to make a few points that are in relation with you just say about the fact that the social impact, going back to the social impact, and I totally agree with you, Barak, that we should be abolitionists as a horizon, but then try to keep the power balance within the field of knowledge now that the ERC fundings are there is no disappearance of these fundings at fight, but as we should fight for their abolition, we can. I mean, what I meant is that you will still have the paradox of our little social impact as academics, even if there is no ERC funding. And there is no way that and we haven't been able collectively to address that. Not only us, but also us with the civil society, with the NGOs, with all our partners that are working in similar, with similar paradox, the jurists, etc. So it's something that, so the fail again, fail better was that, okay, you won't make it disappear. So what do you do with it? And as much as I agree with the abolitionist stand, and I think that maybe it's one of the things that can come out of this webinar as a consensus on, okay, there is I'm taking a journal, I'm keeping a journal of all the flows and the corruptions, as you say, that this ERC research is producing in the creation of knowledge. But there is also resources, And these resources are important when it's about creating an alliance between the academic world and some other, let's say, some other functions of critical thinking, such as people who can help us, like have publication strategies to target the media, or to, I mean, this is something also we can develop. Like we can use those projects to strengthen us, have a vision on social impact. And the reason why I'm saying that is that to go back to the EU, and the interview I had with Elspeth Pitt, what she was saying is that, okay, we shouldn't, at the end of the day, also, we should remember that the capacity to rethink has been here in the past, and changes can come. I mean, at one point, no one believed that there would be an EU enlargement to the post-Soviet world and to the East European countries in 2004, and this happened. But if we don't think that we have a chance to reverse those trends, at least as a horizon, so keeping together the abolitionist efforts and the idea that all this is a question of perception. It's not a question of facts, and we know that as scholars. It's not like migration control is not a question of facts, it's a question of dealing with perception, and those perceptions can be changed. So we still remain with the question of our social impact and maybe how we can, I mean, yeah, we cannot escape, I guess that. And in this regard, the last thing was, my question is that critical research getting EU ERC funding, is this an accident? Is it because evaluators are scholars themselves, so they can, there are different criteria of evaluating a research, so that our peers and colleagues can get some critical thinking research by accident being funded by the EU Commission? Or is it even something that tells us something about the place of academic knowledge? It is part of the game. We are producing a critical knowledge, and it doesn't serve anything. But it's so then, and this is something, even if there is no ERC and there is no those big research, we will be still stuck with this problem. In the US, they're stuck with this problem as well. And I'm thinking of Bill Reading's book, The University in Ruins, published in 1997, and where he was like doing a very accurate a critique of the word excellence as exactly its contrary. And this was the demobilization and the depoliticization of critical research way before even the ERC. So yeah, that was.
So maybe I think, I mean, I would both agree and disagree with Prem to the extent of the centrality of EU knowledge. So I think the EU has made itself an easy victim maybe of our critique, because it has been all about transparency, accountability, impact, that it, and in a way, like, the problem is that you have much clearer kind of ways of, at least structurally, feeding back into the institution that funds you with EU funding than you do with the Bulgarian national funding streams, believe me. And I think you know that from Hungary very well. So we're also in a situation where it is very clear that this is public funding. It is a very small percentage of the funding that European research receives is EU funding. It's like 5-7%. The rest is national agencies and so forth. But the percentage of private funding is even smaller. So that's also something to take into account. So we are dealing with hugely publicly funded research, and one can do things with that. But I think we're sometimes, when focusing on research, we're forgetting the other side of education, which is also, which is teaching. Yeah. So which is, how do we produce knowledge with students? And then on that level, we're also under quite a significant attack. And I think in 1997, similarly, but we're now at the peak of it, which is that by now research is, so there's a kind of very nasty chain of events. On the one hand, our institutions are evaluated on research and research funding, and it's top university that get gifts, and they get it more and more and more, and they become more attractive to paying students, and they come to be taught by excellent researchers. Those excellent researchers buy themselves out from teaching. So in a certain way, part of the impact that we're doing through this research, that we say, we're going to be distributing knowledge, well, we're not doing, because we're trying to buy ourselves out of teaching, because teaching is also becoming more and more abusive, and it's becoming more and more, how do you, like we're asked every day, how do we make sure that our students get jobs on the job market? And you're like, well, 20 years ago, nobody asked me this question. I didn't ask this question when I studied philosophy in Bulgaria. Like, would my faculty members, like my professors, give me the skills to go out on the job market? But there were things that I learned from them, But nowadays we're more and more turned, on the one hand, we're turning into vocational training institutions, even the most kind of research-oriented institutions. And then on the other hand, we're luring people into this, impactful research. And the impactful research usually means getting 97% of public funding for AstraZeneca vaccine, and then having AstraZeneca own the patent for it. So there's something there that's like really, really wrong and true. And I think it didn't come with the EU, but the EU really kind of plays a forefront of where this kind of public-private clashes, and we have the possibility to hold it accountable, which is less the case, I'm afraid, in the case of Orban or Boyko Borisov. So there is something still more democratic possibly there, I think, for now.
Maybe so. Thank you, Maria. We are running a little bit out of time. So Céline and Barak, maybe we can give you the floor for a last round of reactions and discussions before we close.
Thanks, Chowra. I actually wanted to make slightly similar points to what Maria was just saying about how of course, the EU did not invent, privatization of knowledge and commodification of higher education, but I think it did play a very crucial role in furthering it. And the other point I wanted to make, that Maria also made, is the way in which it spreads out forms of inequality on this regional level, because institutions that have a more prestige capital end up, often being identified along old, north, south, east, west lines. And then you see how this kind of solidifies existing hierarchies that are also not invented by the European Union project per se, but which we know have been sort of institutionalized and sort of have very much cemented in the institutional structure of the European Union. But unlike Maria, and I know it's not a very helpful conclusion, I'm really not sure that there is more democratic accountability in the European model of doing politics. So I know, and having been in Hungary as well, I totally understand where you're coming from, and the idea that actually remains, at least on the table there, that by skipping in a way the national level, which has become so difficult to engage with, we get more a possibility for change. Perhaps that's also why I finished on this experience that we had with Pinar, where actually European funding didn't protect us against the sort of most minimal exercise of our academic activities of both research and teaching, and we were in fact to some extent targeted because we had European funding, and that might be sort of specific to the political configuration of Hungary, but we also were criminalized in spite of European funding. And there was absolutely nothing that I was in, both at a very concrete level, in touch with, the project coordinator of my European funding, which was like, oh no, we certainly do not interfere in national politics when it comes to anything, including, higher education. But also, I think at a deeper level, perhaps, you know, connecting it to Chris' comment, like, why should we be surprised when we know the way in which actually a lot of decision making is removed from a more accessible scale of local politics through its inclusion into European level policy making. I'm not sure there's much hope for democracy mechanism at the European level, but that's just my perspective at least. And yeah, Barak, maybe you want to add something depressing.
I will add, if there is time. Yeah, okay, I have 4 very small points. I will try to finish actually on a not depressive one. So starting with the depressive ones, speaking to the point that Chandana raised about doing research as also actually being something that helps the EU to wave in front of whomever is needed to say, look, we invested so much money in it. Of course, we are concerned about it. Of course, it's a matter of importance for us. What I think is very telling there is that we tried in our project to do research, and it was, of course, in our proposal, and we got budgeted for it with Frontex, but we never got access. Although we tried for over 2 years to get access to Frontex, we just didn't get access. And I beg you to think of another field in which the EU would fund the research, let's say chemistry, and then we'll build for you a lab, but then say, oh, sorry, you don't have access to the material that you need to, you know, work with in your experiments. So if you need an example of how the game is actually skewed in ways that this money coming from the EU for research in this field is actually not meant to produce critical knowledge, but just to do something else, which I think is very problematic, and we have to think, what is this something else? And I think we went a lot into the reproduction of the academic field as a neoliberalized one, maybe even too far in that, forgetting that, of course, the money in the first place was meant to do research about the dire situation in which all these cross borders are in. And I think by pouring so much money and having no impact, we really also reproduce a lot the issue of the migrant as being the problem. Of course, because we're never resolving it, we're not adding anything to the solution of it. So what we're actually ending up doing is we reproduce the issue like, okay, migration and refugees is a huge problem. And here is a lot of money. And I just want to also share with you that eventually in June, we got a reply from the European Union. The one that wrote us back was the commissioner for, I had to write it down because it's such a long title. It's the Commissioner for Innovation, Research, Culture, Education and Youth, Maria Gabriel. And yeah, another Maria. And among the other things that she said, like the highlight of her letter back was, oh, don't worry, we just allocated another 100 million euro for research on migration. Right? So we have to all come to terms with the idea that it's not an innocent thing that we just take the money and maybe we will do something critical and maybe we will subvert it in a good way. Just by participating in it, we are already reproducing something that is quite clearly, I think, meant to do something else than what we are doing, we are pretending to do. And the last thing that I want to say, and that is a bit of an uplifting point, is that at the moment in the Netherlands about the national funding level, there is a lot of criticism that accumulated already for some years. And there's just been a report published by some of my colleagues, literally calling for the abolition of this kind of national funding, saying like every anthropologist that has a position in any university should get an equal share of, depending on her percentage of work in the institution, of funding for doing research. And if researchers want to group together and do a big project, of course they can do that. But all that idea of we are all competing in a neoliberal fashion for this kind of a winner takes it all is just a sick game. And it's much, I think, standing to reason that we will also think, okay, why don't we really move into something a bit more radical and call for this abolition, you know? And not just trying to reform it ourselves with our own subversive inclination in a good way.
So on this note, I think that there are some notes that Chris took the effort to take some notes of this meeting. So maybe we can also share the results of this kind of collective discussion. And I think that it was very thought-provoking, and also it's very refreshing to be sharing these ideas, because there is no place dedicated to usually to those kind of critical thinking about what these conditions of work of knowledge production make us produce as knowledge. And I listening to you also, Barak, I was thinking, yes, we sure have to do what, kind of decolonize our minds from those bureaucratic rules, etc., that research is imposing, not only on us, not only on those who have research projects, but also all those who prepare research projects and prepare their CV for because it has totally permeated all the academic culture. So there is maybe there are some really tangible points that can be drawn from this discussion. That's what I wanted to say, and these can be circulated. So thank you very much for both the discussion and enabling it also to be recorded, so that we can maybe share it with those who could not be with us today. And I hope that it's just the start of a conversation. Many things still, I guess, have to be said, like how Greece has been a wonderful laboratory of, those politics, etc. How we can relate to the challenges at the national levels for the elections that are to come, and how to rethink the place of expert knowledge in those very specific political challenges that await us. So I don't know, Maria, maybe we want to just finish this conference, this webinar, by reminding if there are other next programs, and I will thank our participants, and I will thank Barak and Céline for sharing their thoughts with us, and leave you the floor. Thank you.
Thanks, Chowra, and thanks, Céline and Barak. And yes, so we are going to be having more discussions also on open science, and we're going to connect all the kind of, again, structural and political levels. So don't worry, it's not going to be liberal fluff. But for the rest, we are in connection with some lobby groups, and we are trying, through being EASA and being representative body of anthropologists and social sciences in Europe, to make this discussion come to the European table. Like how much further we can go, we don't know. But I think it is a good start to at least start calling things with their own names and try getting people accountable, or, showing that there are other ways. And I think what Barak said at the end is uplifting indeed, that there are other ways to do meaningful research, and we will fight for them locally, nationally, regionally, globally. We will be in touch about the next dates for the webinars. There will be one a month from now until the end of the year. So stay tuned, and thanks all. Thanks also to Jan from Nomad IT, who has been with us and has been immense help. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.